The golden rule of Mario Kart speedrunning is that no matter how perfect a record may seem, it will always be broken eventually. But every once in a while, a run comes along that defies this rule, if only temporarily. These speedruns can stay at the top of their leaderboards for months and even years before they are finally beaten. In the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe time trialing community, these records are tracked in a small subpage where the run that has stayed unbroken for the longest is crowned the duration record. This is the story of that category, and the brutal competition that comes from having the longest lasting record in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. For the first day after the game's release, most records only lasted a few hours. There had been quite a few changes to the way driving worked since the Wii U version of the game, so nobody was particularly good at it yet. Strangely, it only took 4 days for a run to stand alone as the duration record holder. This was a 200cc Neo Bowser City time trial done by a runner named Dragnir on the same day that the game was released. Now, the reason for this is fairly simple. 200cc was a brand new mode that wasn't in Mario Kart 8 for the Wii U, and players simply weren't used to the extra speed, especially on a course as notoriously difficult as Neo Bowser City. But as soon as people realized that this run had slipped through the cracks, it was immediately beaten. Only a couple days later, it happened again with Donut Plains 3 by Mick. This one actually stayed alive for a few more days before it was beaten by a run that got a coin a lap earlier and had a much better way of taking the Shroomless shortcut. And a few days later, it too was passed. But this time by a group of 3 records: Toad's Turnpike, Yoshi Circuit, and Sunshine Airport. These were all pretty good runs, and even though it was still in the early days, it looked like they might stay around for a while. The Toad's Turnpike record was strong due to how basic the course was. There's not a whole ton of places where you can save time, so when a fairly good record was put up by Cole, it wasn't super easy to beat. Yoshi Circuit was a good run because of Kevin. Kevin was a speedrunner who had put a lot of effort into optimizing this course in the first few days. He had managed to find quite a few new shortcuts and strategies, shaving 4 seconds off the record and setting a fairly impressive run in the process. The Sunshine Airport run had a very similar story to Yoshi Circuit, with a runner who implemented quite a few new tricks and simply executed his final run very well. However, in the coming weeks, both Toad's Turnpike and Yoshi Circuit would be beaten, which left the undisputed duration record to Matthew and Sunshine Airport, for about a day before this one too was beaten. And this wasn't going to last for very long, because there were 2 more records mere days behind it. But the player Light had noticed something about one of these. At the end of the Dry Desert run, there's a Shroomless shortcut where you repeatedly hop over this off-road to cut off the corner. But Light discovered that if you hopped in the right spots, you were able to launch off of the upwards-facing part and spend much less time in the off-road. He implemented this trick into a time trial, and even though his lap 3 was frankly abysmal, this run was able to beat the old record by about 1/3 of a second. And now that Dry was out of the running, Jimmy's Sherbetland run was able to take the duration record. This run honestly wasn't that special. Of course, it was still fast, but that's all it was. There weren't really any difficult tricks done, and the driving was somewhat simplistic. So when a runner named StarXLX saw how long this run had stayed around for, he figured that it was probably fairly outdated and could be beaten relatively easily. And he was absolutely right. At 24 days of duration, StarXLX set a new record, and over the next couple days managed to get the time down by over half a second. But there's another aspect to this story, a part that StarXLX himself had completely overlooked. By beating Jimmy's Sherbetland run, he had unknowingly opened a chance at the duration record to a 23-day-old Mute City run, his own Mute City run. And it was going to be very hard to beat. StarXLX was able to get the Mute City record for one main reason: mushrooms. When the game was first released, people used their mushrooms at this shortcut near the end of the course because it's easily the largest on the track. But here's the thing, it's actually completely possible to take this shortcut without using a mushroom at all, which frees it up for use somewhere else. This trick is extremely difficult, but StarXLX still went for it on all 3 of his laps, resulting in a total time save of over 600 milliseconds and a world record that lasted for 23 days at this point. However, the Mute City run had competition. The Piranha Plant Slide 150cc record was also at 23 days, and this one seemed even more difficult to beat. It was held by a Japanese player named Penguin Samurai, who importantly used Inside Drift. Inside Drift is an alternative drifting style found on a few bikes in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Unlike drifting on most vehicles where the back of your kart swings out wide in order to charge a mini turbo, these bikes do a maneuver that's best described as committing to the turn, where they lean in and turn very sharply. In almost all cases, vehicles with traditional drifting are superior, but in the early days of Piranha Plant Slide, inside drifting bikes were actually considered better for handling the course's rather unconventional layout. Due to how rare this drifting version is in time trials, there weren't that many players that could compete with it at this high of a level, and due to the fact that Penguin Samurai had almost exclusively time trialed Piranha Plant Slide, essentially nobody else had the driving ability to beat him. On May 28th, the two records passed the 24-day mark. Both were now technically the longest lasting, but for one of them to be crowned, one had to fall. And only a few days later, at 30 days of duration, Mute City was finally beaten. We don't have the original footage from the run that ended up beating Star XLX's, but by analyzing one of Danny's subsequent runs, it becomes pretty clear how he was able to take the top spot. His execution of the Shroomless shortcut was phenomenal, and his overall driving on the track was simply faster than the previous record. But here's the thing, Danny wasn't just any random player. He held the record with the next highest duration behind the two 30-day runs. He had just taken out one of his competitors, and the other was next. Rather than being put off by the fact that Piranha Plant Slide used inside drift, Danny was actually excited by the prospect of learning how to use it at a high level, so he began working on taking the record down. After a while of playing on the course, he discovered that it was actually faster to go to the right path in the block section, and this gave him the last little advantage he needed to take the record for himself at 46 days. But later that day, Light beat his run, killing Danny's chances of getting the longest lasting record title. After this, there was a decent gap of a few weeks where there were essentially no challengers to the duration record. But on the 30th of June, another run took over from Piranha Plant Slide. Now, the reason this run survived is a little bit different. Of course, Cole's run was good, but it mostly comes down to this course simply not being very attractive to top-level speedrunners. Firstly, Mumu is kinda just really boring. You go around in a circle 3 times, and there are essentially no places where interesting techniques or strategies come into play. But the final nail in the coffin is that this run is also inside drift, so while people kept ignoring this run, it kept gaining duration. This continued for about a month until it was finally taken off of the leaderboard at 70 days. At this point, there were a lot of active runs on the heels of the Mumu Meadow record, so it was clear that it was getting overtaken soon. The question was, by who? Turns out that it was simply the next run in line, SNES Rainbow Road by Ren. This run had experienced quite a bit of competition early on, and when you consider how simple the track is, it makes sense that this one would be really well optimized for the time. However, this wasn't enough to save it, and it was beaten a couple weeks later by a time trial that had a significantly better lap 3. And 2 days later, the duration record was taken again by a Grumble Volcano run from a player named Kevin. But with how quickly the duration record had been changing hands recently, surely this wouldn't stand for long, right? 200 days later, and Kevin's run was still at the top of the leaderboard. It was approaching 300 days of total duration with no sign of stopping. So how did we get here? Well, before I answer that question, I need to tell you about the sponsor of this video, REDMAGIC, and their brand new Astra gaming tablet. Inside, this thing is a monster. It runs on a Snapdragon 8 Elite CPU, Adreno 830 GPU, and up to 24 gigabytes of RAM, meaning that no matter what I throw at this thing, it handles it perfectly. And all this powerful hardware is able to keep cool due to the 20,000 RPM gaming fan. But easily the most impressive part of the Astra is the screen. Firstly, it's an OLED, so the color accuracy is phenomenal. It gets really bright too, with a peak of 1600 nits, and to round it all off, the display has a resolution of 2.4K and runs it up to 165 Hz, which means that on-screen motion is incredibly smooth. But being this powerful doesn't mean it compromises on its portability or form. It's barely over half a centimeter thick and weighs less than a Switch 2, even with the Joy-Cons detached. There's also this small switch on the side which can be programmed to do a few different things, but by default it opens up Game Space, which is REDMAGIC's dedicated game launcher and overlay, which is great for quickly changing settings and accessing various information. Personally, my favorite thing about the Astra tablet is how perfect it is for sharing games from my computer while on the go. The screen lets me play in near original quality, while the excellent wireless connectivity and blazing fast processor keep latency low. So if any of this interests you, I highly recommend checking it out from the link in the description. And now, back to Kevin's 300-day-old record. This run had survived so long due to a perfect storm of circumstances. Firstly, Grumble Volcano was not very well liked by the community. It was considered bouncy and unpredictable because of multiple places during the run that seemed like they were based more on luck than driving skill. Also, the fact that the run was on 200cc definitely hindered competition. Even though it was now almost a year since the game's release, runners were still not fully comfortable with the faster speed. Kevin's run was a bit of a golden outlier where everything just went perfectly. His shroom cut was flawless on all laps, and as far as racing lines go, his run was incredibly solid. All of these circumstances created an environment where not a single player had the drive to get the record, except for one. Meet Tommy, a runner from Ireland who liked Grumble Volcano far more than the typical runner. He had been time trialing the course recently and had actually been putting up some pretty good times. The only problem is that Tommy had never held a world record before. Sure, he had been on the top 10 leaderboard a few times, but beating one of the best records in the game was a different beast entirely. But as Tommy's times continued to improve, people began rooting for him to take the #1 spot. By the 24th of March, he was in 3rd place on the leaderboards. Still half a second behind Kevin, but great progress. Over the next few months, he slowly got better and better until finally, on the 9th of May 2018, he got onto the best run of his life. His lap 1 was faster than any world record up until that point, and by the start of lap 3, he was 530 milliseconds ahead of his 3rd place run, on pace to take world record. And he knew it. His nerves were through the roof, and yet he just kept going. And after hitting the shortcut and crossing the line, he checked the timer, a 1:24.956. Tommy had done it. Against all odds, he had gotten his first ever Mario Kart world record on Grumble Volcano and had beaten the now 325-day-old run, meaning for the first time in nearly a year, the duration record was again up for grabs. So how long would it be before the longest-lasting record title was taken by another runner? Well, the truth is, at this point, Grumble Volcano wasn't the only one to make it to 300 days. There were 4 of them, and the highest, a Shy Guy Falls record by Jimmy, was only a week away from taking the record. Jimmy's Shy Guy Falls record was incredibly impressive due to how ridiculously precise this run was. Firstly, there was a strat used at the beginning of the 2nd and 3rd laps where you cut across a small piece of grass. On its own, this isn't too difficult, but if you stay in it for just a little bit too long, the off-road takes all of your speed and kills the run. But the main difficulty with this track comes at the end. First, you have to hit a perfect no-item shortcut or NISC onto the ramp to avoid losing speed, start another drift on the ramp, charge it in mid-air, release it upon hitting the ground, and immediately start charging another mini-turbo. Then, while in the drift, you need to perfectly aim your kart to land just before the wall and then shroom around it. And this has to be executed perfectly on every single lap. So it's not too surprising that this run took the duration record and ran with it for a few weeks. But at 346 days, the player Davi managed to improve the track in a few places and barely got a 28 millisecond improvement. And now that Shy Guy Falls was down, the record was ready to be passed on yet again. It looked like the next longest lasting run would be a Piranha Plant Slide 200cc run by a player named Blue. However, only 2 days after Shy Guy Falls was beaten, this record was taken by a player named Super FX, which meant that the next candidate for duration record became the only other 300 day out of this group, which was a Sweet Sweet Canyon record held by none other than Jimmy. This run was his chance to hold on to the duration record even after the death of his Shy Guy Falls time, and it looked like he might just pull it off. This run was about as close to perfection as 8 Deluxe speedruns got at the time. There are so many places in this run where he gets incredibly close to a wall, and yet barely avoids bonking. The execution of the shroom shortcut was impeccable on all laps. It was an absolute masterclass in Mario Kart driving, and the duration showed it. But as is the case with speedrunning, nothing lasts forever. And in early June, a speedrunner named Super FX set his sights on the record. On the 8th, he managed to tie Jimmy's time down to the millisecond. But to truly lower the record and knock it off of the duration leaderboard, he would need to beat it outright. And the very next day, he managed to do just that, lowering the time by 10 milliseconds. So now that this record had been beaten, the next in line for the longest lasting record category should be this run, which is now at over 302 days, right? Well, there's something that I haven't mentioned yet. Super FX wasn't the only person to tie this record. This feat had also been accomplished by a player named Ryan 302 days ago. That's right, this record never had a chance at taking over from Jimmy's, because it was the same record. And now that this one was wiped from the board as well, there were no more runs to threaten Jimmy's lead for the next 120 days. But as the next highest record reached 260 days, it was struck from the leaderboard. The next run in line, an 150cc Sherbetland run, barely lasted 11 days before it was beaten. The same thing happened with the next run, and the next, and the next. Almost as soon as these runs got on top, they would be beaten and drop out of the running. Despite this, there was a clear trend upwards, making it inevitable that eventually a record would stick around for long enough. And finally, in March of 2019, one did. This was a Twisted Mansion 200cc record set by Timo. Like a lot of the other runs that had held the duration record before, this one uses a combo with inside drift, and it is a beautiful use of it. Some of the corners on this track are cut so insanely close that it's genuinely unbelievable that these turns are even possible. There were some corners that might have been able to be taken slightly tighter, but with how insanely precise the rest of the course was, competing with Timo's record was a daunting task. And so nobody was surprised when this run blasted straight past the previous duration record and continued upwards, passing by an entire year of duration. Now, Timo's run was incredibly good, but it wasn't perfect, and Japanese player Ejikara saw an opening. He was able to capitalize on Timo's slightly slower lap 2 and barely lower the time by 73 milliseconds. Timo immediately took the record back, but the damage was done. The run that had lasted for over a year was finally beaten. At this point, the void created by Jimmy's Sweet Sweet Canyon record had been filled, so there were plenty of records ready to take the top spot. In fact, the closest record behind Twisted Mansion was now only 2 days away. So on the 9th of April 2019, Toad Harbor 150cc by Swift claimed the top spot. This run also fell into the category of solid records that were on tracks that nobody really loved playing. With the exception of the tram hop on lap 2, the run is almost completely comprised of straight driving with a few turns. Despite the lack of players, this record's days were numbered. It had already been tied by a Japanese player named Nasuno, who was still doing attempts to beat it outright. And only a few weeks later, Nasuno beat the record. He missed a coin on the first lap, but due to improved driving on the second and third, he was able to lower the time by about 60 milliseconds. And on June 17, 2019, Mario Circuit 150cc by K4i overtook Toad Harbor as the game's longest-lasting record. Due to how basic it was, there were very few places where runners could save time on this track. Regardless, half a year later, a new record was posted by a player named Seabass. There weren't really any noticeable differences between the runs, but due to imperceptible improvements, it was 4 milliseconds faster, less than a quarter of a frame. Soon after that, another run hit 592 days, and this one looked like it might stay around for a while. It was on dry desert, which immediately makes it unappealing to anyone with eyes. Beyond that, you're on 150cc, which means that there isn't much interesting tech to do. But the most important reason why this record hadn't been beaten yet was the person who set it, Laishan. In early 2018, Laishan had gone on a rampage, lowering the dry desert record by 800 milliseconds. This would be insane on any track, but on a course as basic as dry desert? This was unbelievable amounts of time save. So what did Laishan do to lower the record this much? The answer is, it's just better everywhere. Every single aspect of this run is simply done phenomenally well. And because of this, the run was so solid that nobody even wanted to attempt to close the half-second gap between his record and second place. But right before 2 years of duration, it was finally taken down by one of the best 8 Deluxe players ever, Alberto. Shortly afterward, the duration record was taken by Ejikara and his 150cc Toad's Turnpike run. This was a strong record for many of the same reasons that Dry was. It was a fairly unappealing track to play, aided by a strong run from a top player that was very dedicated to the track. But also, due to the fact that this course is so simple and there are so few turns to optimize, this run was about as close to perfection as you could get, so it was going to be brutally difficult to lower the time any further. 8 months later, it was finally beaten by Ejikara himself. Somehow, he had managed to squeeze another 15 milliseconds of time from this track, ending the run's reign at 892 days. But this time was different. For the past year, the duration record had traded hands pretty quickly after being beaten. This was due to a pocket of a few hard-to-beat runs that had all been gaining duration together. When one was taken, the rest just kept moving upwards, overtaking it in the process. But now, this reserve of records had been completely drained. Ejikara's run was now an island without anything even close to it for the next year and a half. And even the records down here kept getting beaten, driving the gap farther and farther away. We were gonna be here for a while. It's now June 6th, 2022, and Edgy Toad's Turnpike run has been at the top of the longest-lasting record list for 1,000 days, a longer period of time than the duration record itself. But finally, there was something approaching it. Mute City 150cc by Stir. In the days leading up to his now 877-day-old run, Stir had set 9 other records on this course, across which he lowered the record by 222 milliseconds. Compared to a lot of other instances of time save, even across those included in this video, this might not seem like a lot, especially over the course of 10 individual records. But that's the point. The time save is impressive because of how small it is. These weren't large chunks of easy improvement. These records were achieved by pure dedication and pushing the track to its absolute limit. And the final run was the culmination of this, being as close to Mute City perfection as you could get. There are so many places in this run where he gets within mere pixels of falling off or hitting a wall, and the shroomless shortcut is flawless on all laps. This was one of the strongest runs set in this game so far, and it showed. 15 days later, it claimed the title of longest standing record with no sign of slowing down. A few months later, and the record was approaching 4 digits of duration. But then, tragedy struck. At 991 days, Wave 4 of the DLC released. This should have been a great day for speedrunning. 8 more courses to explore, optimize, and play on. But for the duration category, this was a nightmare. Because in addition to all the new content that was added, speed and acceleration stats for some kart parts had been adjusted. These changes resulted in kart combos so good that they allowed runners to set times much lower than the current track records without a lot of the deep optimization that had been required to get them originally. Records started dropping like flies. Stir's Mute City run held on for barely 3 days before it was beaten. But would there even be a run that could take over from Mute City? After the dust had settled a bit, candidates were scarce. The balance patch had eviscerated the 150cc leaderboards. There were only a handful of courses that had records from before Wave 4. The 200 leaderboards had fared a bit better, but still nearly 2/3 of the records had been replaced. But there was a small sliver of hope. It turns out that Mute City wasn't the only track that Stir had pushed to perfection. There was one more record he had set that was arguably even better than his Mute City run, and it had survived the balance patch. With the exception of a single day in late 2020, Stir had held the record on this track for nearly 5 years consecutively, and had set 24 records in that period, resulting in the 59,968 that was still active. There are so many places where a run on this track can be killed, but when you do every single one of these perfectly, you get a record that is truly one of a kind. So it was a surprise to absolutely no one when it tanked yet another balance patch with ease and continued flying upwards. And on February 19th, 2024, it happened. Mario Circuit passed Mute City at 994 days. Only 6 left until a 4-digit duration, and who knew how much beyond that. But on this day, something unbelievable happened. Stir posted a record on GBA Mario Circuit 200, forever locking his record at 1,000 days of duration. Now, Stir had done this run a few weeks beforehand in preparation for 1,000 days, so technically his 59,968 hadn't stood alone for 1,000 days, but no other player had managed to overtake him in this time, so the official number was still 1,000. With this run beaten, Stir no longer had any active records longer than a couple hundred days old, meaning his time as the longest lasting record holder was almost certainly over. But perhaps it was for the best, because what is up next is possibly the most legendary Mario Kart 8 Deluxe record ever set. So what made Alpha's run on this track so strong? The answer lies in the course itself. Cheeseland is an incredibly luck-based and inconsistent track, which makes the numerous difficult tricks already found on this course infinitely harder. Firstly, the beginnings of laps 2 and 3 have a very difficult shortcut where you go straight through the cheese blocks. You have to time multiple incredibly precise hops in order to get through this fast enough to avoid losing all your speed in the off-road. And immediately afterwards, there's another nearly impossible gauntlet where you have to perfectly thread the needle between the edge of the tunnel and another set of cheese blocks. On top of all of that, your driving on the rest of the course needs to be practically flawless to make sure the run is both fast enough and you have the alignment for the numerous shortcuts. And if that wasn't enough, you also have to deal with a ton of small divots and bumpy parts of the track that can completely throw you off if your driving isn't flawless. All of these things combine to make Cheeseland arguably the most brutal track in the entire speedrunning scene. And Alpha had mastered it all. He had saved so much time on this course over the years and had gotten the first sub 17, 16, and 15-second runs, and his final record on the track was the culmination of all of this, being 700 milliseconds ahead of the next closest speedrunner, Genzua. This record was practically unbeatable. The only issue it had was a tiny slowdown during the shortcut on lap 2, but the rest of the run was so good that it didn't matter. Nobody could even get close to Alpha's driving on the rest of the course, so it stayed as the record with essentially 0 challengers. The run kept climbing the duration leaderboards. By the start of 2025, it was less than a month away from Stir's Mario Circuit run, and on January 17th, it crossed the 1,000-day threshold, becoming the longest-lasting record in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe history. But this time, it was different. This run was so insanely strong that it might just continue going forever. To beat this, they would need a miracle, and a player named James might just have something. In Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, there's a trick called Motion Glider that is performed by turning with the joystick and motion controls at the same time. This causes your kart to turn way more than normal and allows you to move quite a bit faster. But something really weird happens when you hit a ramp wall in this state. For some reason, it causes you to get launched to the side incredibly quickly. This is called a Genzua glider, and while it is incredibly fast, there are very few places where you can actually use it in a run. But in March of 2025, James found something really interesting. If you land from a motion glider, start a drift, and then hit another glider panel while you're tilted to the side, you still get the full effects of the trick. James shared his findings with Alberto, who instantly thought of a track that had 2 glider panels that would be perfect for this. And that track was Cheeseland. Alberto started working on finding a good setup for this, and shortly afterwards actually got a really good launch off of the second panel. It caused Lakitu to pick him up, but here's the thing. The finish line is right here, so if you do this on the final lap, you can complete the race before the pickup happens, negating the need for any recovery after this point. Over the next few hours, Alberto and James worked on making this as fast as possible, and after a few optimizations, they had a method that was way quicker than the route taken by Alpha in his world record. And now that the glitch was ready, it was finally time to beat the longest standing record in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. But it still wasn't going to be easy. Even though Alberto was the best player and was aided by the most powerful glitch in the game, Alpha's run was so unbelievably good that he was struggling to keep up in the earlier laps. Alberto's main issue was the shortcut on lap 1. This version is especially hard because this early into the race you have less coins, which means you don't jump as far and need to be more precise. On the 31st of March, Alberto was attempting the world record live while using one of the greatest stream overlays I've ever seen. He hadn't been doing very well and was about to give up when he got on this run. He got a perfect shortcut on lap 1, and even though he had a few mistakes, he was still only a couple hundred milliseconds behind Alpha's time by the middle of the 3rd lap. He hit the first glider panel and headed for the second. And after barely avoiding the chain chomp, he launched off the final glider panel, crossing the finish line 87 milliseconds ahead of Alpha. The longest lasting record in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe was finally beaten. Then, we get to today. The closest active record to Alpha's Cheeseland run is a 55-second Donut Plains run done, rather ironically, by Genzua. If nothing changes, he will take the title of longest standing record on the 11th of October, 2025. This video was very difficult to make and would never have happened without the incredible generosity of runners who helped me understand the convoluted history of this category. So one final gigantic thanks to StarXLX, Danny, Tommy, Alpha, Alberto, and James. And if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and leaving a like to help me continue making content like this. And thank you for watching.